Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think we're gonna give it a couple more minutes and then we'll get started.
And all of the live stream settings are good to go, so we should be ready in just a moment. Right.
We'll get started in about 1 minute. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Eunice Kim. I'm the Long Range Planning Manager for the City of Salem. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today about housing and housing needs and our housing production strategy. I'd like to ask other staff at City of Salem to introduce themselves. So Lisa, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Hi, Lisa Anderson-Middleby. I am the Deputy Director of Community Planning Development Department and the city's planning administrator. Austin, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Austin Ross. I'm a long-range planner with the City of Salem. I'll hand it off to Michael Brown, I guess.
Hello, Michael Brown, Financial Services Manager for Community Planning and Development. Sorry, I'll hand it off to Tiffany Otis.
Hi, Tiffany Otis, Federal Programs Manager. Tony?
Hi, everyone. Tony Whitler, Federal Programs Compliance Manager. Good to be here.
Zachary?
It's me. Hi, I'm Zachary. I'm an admin analyst for the planning department.
If I missed anyone, let me know. Anyone else from the city? Great. So I want to introduce Beth Goodman. She's with Echo Northwest and a consultant firm that is helping us with this project. She will be leading the webinar today. Just as a reminder, we are asking everyone to turn their video and microphones off. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And then after the presentation, we will be answering them. So Beth, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Beth Goodman. As Eunice said, I'm from Echo Northwest, and I'm very pleased and honored to be here with you today. Working with me on this project are a number of different staff at Echo Northwest. Specifically, we've got here with us today Scott Goodman, who is our associate helping power this project. And if we get any specific questions about data, that kind of thing, we may ask Scott for some help on that. So thank you very much for being here, Scott. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and jump into the presentation. Eunice and Lisa, I assume if you have anything that you need me to say differently or again, that you'll jump in. So we are looking here at a project for Salem's housing production strategy. A housing production strategy, as we'll discuss in a few minutes, is a new action plan that cities over 10,000 people are required by the state to complete every 6 or 8 years, depending on whether the cities are inside of Metro or outside. And as you all know, Salem is outside of Metro. We're going to discuss an overview of the housing production strategy. We'll talk a lot about Salem's unmet housing needs and ask for some input on housing needs to help us better understand some of the barriers to accessing housing. And then we'll answer your questions. So we'll try to keep this not too awfully long and go at a fair pace. But if you have questions, we can pop back to the slides and answer them as we go. So while this is a new requirement and a new action plan that Salem will have, it's not like Salem isn't already engaged with the issue of need for housing. Salem's been doing a lot of work on housing, especially over the last decade. So some examples of what Salem has done is it's looked for surplus land within the community where cottages can be built to serve low-income seniors. It's looked at system development charge waivers for affordable housing and accessory dwelling units. System development charges are charges for infrastructure. So for instance, charges for road or water or wastewater that are charged when new housing is built. So the city's been focusing on types of housing that are more affordable to people who live in Salem. The Our Salem project was your comprehensive plan project, and it ended up rezoning land to allow for more multifamily and mixed use development. The Safe and Livability Bond provides funding for affordable housing. And of course, one of the hardest things to get to support housing development is funding. So that's a very important bond. There's some property tax exemptions that Salem has for multi-unit projects, which allows projects to operate with less expense, with the trade-off of having housing that's more affordable. And of course, the Salem Housing Authority has a lot of different projects that we could speak to if needed a little later. So a housing production strategy is an 8-year action plan. And it's in part to develop housing development. It's to promote housing development. It's also meant to preserve existing affordable housing and to do a few other things related to housing for people experiencing houselessness, as well as equity considerations. So equity is a line that comes throughout this project, and we'll be talking about that as we go along. So we'll be understanding what Salem's unmet housing needs are, both in terms of income, but then also in terms of housing needs that don't appear in the data. So that means we need to be talking to people. Salem has been and will continue to be having those conversations with people that you just don't hear from as much in community conversations. We start with what the barriers are to developing housing that's affordable to Salem's residents. So we understand the barriers, we understand what Salem's already doing, and then we look at other policies or actions that can help the city overcome those barriers or lower those barriers so that there's more housing that's affordable for people to live in Salem and perhaps live and work in Salem. The kinds of policies we'll be talking about are things like financial incentives and funding strategies. So how can you support development of housing that is more affordable across a range of income levels? Regulatory changes, so things like changes to the zoning code, if there are barriers to developing certain types of housing, and they are housing that would meet affordability needs or other needs for the community, then those are things that we should talk about in regulatory changes. So things like partnerships with your organizations that are focused on affordable housing and things adjacent to affordable housing, those are very important. And what the city can do in those partnerships is look at things like bringing funding to the table, where you've got things like a bond, land acquisition or surplus of existing city-owned land or state-owned land or other publicly owned land. Those can all be put into projects that are developed by your partners. So this isn't about Salem, the city, becoming a developer itself. It's about what Salem can do to support development of housing that's affordable and working with those partnerships. There's a lot of other creative strategies that we'll be looking at as we go through the housing production strategy. So you might ask yourself, gosh, doesn't Salem have a housing needs analysis? And the answer is yes, it does. It was completed in 2014. Echo Northwest helped the city with that project then. What we found in that project is that there was enough land for housing overall, but there wasn't enough land for multifamily housing. And so you can see the actions there are about allowing more housing options, eliminating parking requirements, rezoning land, and many other things. City has taken many of those actions at this point. The housing needs analysis was adopted as part of the Our Salem project in 2022. And so a housing production strategy, as I said, it's a new state requirement, and it starts with refining the understanding of housing need and figuring out where the gaps are in existing policies, identifying and evaluating new policies, new strategies or actions to meet those gaps, to lower the barriers to accessing or building housing or preserving existing affordable housing. And then overall, looking at all of the actions taken together to assess whether the strategies help achieve fair and equitable outcomes. Salem, like all of Oregon's cities, will be doing this on a rolling process. So Salem will next complete a housing needs analysis in 2030, and then a year after that, we'll be looking at a housing production strategy again. So this is not a one and done project. This is an iterative cycle that cities in Oregon will be undertaking on a regular basis. So looking at what we're doing here and what our schedule is, we are in items 1 and 2, analyzing housing needs and housing market opportunities. This is progressing on through the summer and into the fall of 2024. We're beginning to look at actions to address the first sets of housing gaps, housing policy gaps, and barriers to housing. We'll be continuing that on through winter 2024. And by spring 2025, we'll have a draft housing production strategy. And the city will be looking at adoption of that in spring 2025. Throughout all of that, there's community engagement. And we'll be talking about the community engagement beyond something like a webinar. This is a more informative part of community engagement. There's also much more interactive community engagement going on. So a big thing we want to call out here is looking at land that might be rezoned to mixed use or might have been rezoned to mixed use, and making sure that it's feasible for developing housing in those mixed use areas. So we're doing a range of market analysis and talking with housing developers to understand the gaps in feasibility. And so that will be one type of input that we have into the housing production strategy. We want to make sure that any actions we have in the housing production strategy have a reasonable chance of success. And so when you're talking about things around development feasibility, you certainly have to talk to a range of developers. Okay, so going back and talking about Salem's unmet housing needs. Some of you may have heard of these things and some of you may not have. Unsurprisingly, housing prices are increasing faster than income. Between 2012 and 22, household incomes on average increased by 51%, rent increased by 68% on average, and home sales prices increased by 173%. They nearly doubled. And so what used to happen back before, in the 1990s and before, is that income and rents would grow at about the same pace. So people continued to be able to afford rents. Well, that's deviated and it's continued to deviate further and further. And in some of our markets across Oregon, rents have increased a lot faster than household incomes have increased. But this is part of the problem that you see in the housing market is people just can't afford rent because rents keep going up and housing sales prices are even worse in terms of increasing. And what you can see is on average, the median price of a single family home in Salem has been going up above $400,000 for a little while now over the last couple of years. It's on pace. to have the same kind of increases that we're seeing across Oregon. So Salem's housing is more affordable than Oregon's on average. That's especially true since the Portland metro area has a lot more expensive housing. And some of our smaller areas also have a lot more expensive housing. Salem's housing needs are changing. So with your changes in demographics, eventually people need different types of housing throughout their life. So what we're seeing here is that in Salem, the majority of population growth has been for people 70 years and older. So 60% of population growth has been for that group. That's similar to what Oregon's seeing. You've seen a little bit of growth in the under 20 and then working age, the 20 to 69-year-olds. And so the implication of this is that as people get older and they start to retire, income decreases, their household size and household composition changes, and there are fewer people per household. And then for some people, you also start to have mobility and other disability issues that may cause people to think about changing what kind of housing they're living in. So a lot of people want to live in their existing housing until they can't. Some people want to downsize before that. So you've got those changes. And that's really saying that you're going to need more housing in the near term that is for smaller households. And also, Salem's becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. You can see a number of different racial and ethnic groups here, and they all, or most of them, have some amount of growth. The largest group of color in Salem is Latino of any race, which accounts for 29% of your population in 2022, up from about 20% in 2010. 2 or more races is also a larger group of color, along with other races. So what you can see is Salem has a fair bit of racial and ethnic diversity. And what that means is different groups have different types of housing needs. So for instance, Latino households may need larger physical units because they have, on average, larger household sizes. So you see more children or more multi-generational households. And so that has implications for the types of housing that are needed there. There's a lot more information that we're paying attention to about demographics, but that's a little sample of that. And these have implications for different unmet housing needs. So then looking at this by income level, here we have a fairly complex chart that I'll break down for you. In the Marion and Polk County region, 100% of area median income for a household of 4 is $89,000. And that household can afford about $2,200 a month in monthly housing costs. They can afford to purchase a home of about $220,000 to $270,000 for a sales price. And that's assuming that they aren't paying more than they can afford, which of course many of us do pay more than we can afford for housing, especially rental housing. Well, when we compare that to median sales price at $429,000, obviously a household with that income could not afford that median home sales price. You'd have to earn about 160% of area median income. What we've also seen is with the increase in mortgage loan rates over the last few years, that's pushed what people can afford, pushed down what people can afford in terms of sales prices because borrowing has become more expensive. And so looking at average monthly rent, including rent and utilities, the average rental cost in Salem is about $1,700 a month. And that includes basic utilities like electricity and heat, for instance. Well, you could earn about 80% of area median income for a household of 4, or about $67,000, and afford that rent. When you're thinking about newly built housing, because that's what we're talking about a lot here, newly built housing that is built by private developers typically has rents of above 80% of area median income. So it wouldn't be affordable to a lot of folks in the 80% of area median income, generally speaking. Newly built ownership housing typically is going to cost more than your median home sales price. Not always, but typically. And so that's going to be affordable to some of the folks in this 120% or higher of area median income. And then there are a lot of people who can't afford market rate rents. They just can't afford the nearly $1,700 a month in rent. And so newly built housing for that group, which is 60% or less of area median income generally, that's built by your affordable housing developers, your housing authority, and some other nonprofits. You also sometimes get housing that's affordable in that range from things like mobile homes, especially older mobile homes. There's not a lot of housing that's affordable, especially new housing, unless it is income restricted housing, so has federal or state funding in it. When we look at how Salem's households are distributed among those groups, what you find is nearly 40% of Salem's existing households have income of 60% or less of AMI. About 31% have income at the 120%. So you've got a large population that has lower income and can't afford market rate housing. So newly built housing, unless it's income subsidized, isn't going to be housing that's affordable to those households in general. When you talk about newly built rental housing, it's going to be affordable to this top 50%. Sort of leaving this 9% here in the middle, and also having difficulty finding housing that's affordable. So as we're thinking about the housing production strategy and preservation of existing housing, we're thinking about this different income distribution, that there is need for housing that's affordable all along this income distribution. And what's affordable, of course, changes by income level. So another way to think about this is look at households in Salem that are cost burdened. And a household is said to be cost burdened if it's spending 60% or more of its gross income on housing costs. And housing costs are things like rent and utilities, or mortgage, interest, insurance, and utilities. So 37% of Salem's households are cost burdened. 19% of them are severely cost burdened, meaning that they're paying 50% or more of their gross income on housing costs. Those households are the ones that are in most trouble. So when we look at this by tenure, what you see is 51% of renter households are cost burdened, and 30% are severely cost burdened. Those households are in the most trouble. 25% of homeowners are cost burdened in Salem. So then we're thinking about the housing production strategies and what actions are we going to have in there. We're also thinking beyond the data about income and cost burden, and we're thinking about other types of unmet housing needs. So people experiencing houselessness, they could be temporarily houseless or chronically houseless. They could be alone or with children. There's a lot of different solutions and policies that support people who are houseless finding shelter and then finding more permanent housing. And the types of housing that they need really range quite a lot, from literally shelter to affordable, say, income restricted housing, and eventually possibly, in some cases, to market rate housing, permanent supportive housing, so housing that includes a certain number of services with it. You also have housing needs that are unmet for different racial or ethnic groups. So the unmet housing needs can be around language barriers, because you certainly have immigrant communities in Salem. So language barriers, things around documentation, ability to afford first and month rent, of course, that's for everybody. And then you also have need to get housing, access to housing without discrimination. And for many of us, like I personally have not experienced housing discrimination, but it certainly exists. And people of color are more commonly experiencing discrimination. So I'm going to combine housing needs for people of 65 years older and people with disabilities. Sometimes it's for a smaller unit for people 65 years and older. People with disabilities, it's for a unit that is accessible. So a unit that meets their physical or other type of disabilities. And that could be something like ramps and wider doorways, for instance. It could also be things like access to housing with mental health or other services. And again, this group needs access to housing without discrimination. So we'll be thinking about these things as we're developing the actions in the housing production strategy and making sure that we are, to the extent possible, making sure that the policies are responsive to these unmet needs. So now we're going to do something a little fun and a little bit different. So if you have your phone with you, if you just hold up your phone and you go to your camera app and you know, point it at this little thing here and you go to VBox, which will come up and it'll bring up a survey we're going to take. So I'm going to bring the survey onto my screen in a moment or two. And that will still allow you to use this to access the survey. So I'm going to give everybody a moment or two, and I'm hoping everybody here will play along a little bit. All right, so Salem just completed an online housing needs survey. So have you already taken the survey? And I'm going to wait here until we have more of our participants answering yes, no, or not sure.
Beth, there's a question about putting the link in the chat for the
Oh.
view.
Could I get Scott to put the link in the chat? Because if I go back,
So
I'm not sure what'll happen. So we'll give it a moment or two more. This is not the most important of the questions. There we go. The link is now in the chat. So I'll give it a moment or two more. Okay. So I'm going to close this question. And what we see is you had, I think it was about 535 responses. About half of the people, half of the 21 people who answered this had not taken the online survey. And, you know, almost 43% had taken it. So I'm glad that we've got some people who've seen both. All right. So then question number 2, how concerned are you about housing affordability? Very concerned, somewhat concerned, not concerned. You're not sure what your concern is. I like that there's a counter on here so I can tell how many people might answer. It's very handy. Okay. We seem to have 22 answers. So what we see here is that there's a lot of concern. 2/3 of you are very concerned, and a third of you almost is somewhat concerned. So what I'm hearing here is that there's a lot of concern about affordability. It's the underlying piece. It's the easy to point to piece in unmet housing need. It's also very hard to solve for. If there were easy solutions, then I expect that more of those easy solutions would be in place. So in your opinion, what are the main reasons that housing affordability is important in Salem? You can choose up to 3 things. People should be able to choose the type of housing they want to live in. Affordable housing makes the community more inclusive and diverse. Seniors should be able to keep living here as they age. People who work here should be able to live here. People of all income levels should be able to live here. People should be able to live without fear of being displaced. And I do not think housing affordability is important. So Eunice, while people are voting, I know we've got some preliminary results from the survey. When do you expect the survey results will be made publicly available?
We can put them online when we put this slide presentation in the webinar recording online.
Okay, so you'll see answers to these questions and some other questions as well. That survey was conducted in, I believe, Eunice, 4 different languages. And I don't remember all of the languages off the top of my head.
It's English, Spanish, Chuukese, and Marshallese.
Okay, we'll just give it another moment or so. Okay. So the most common answers are people who work here should be able to live here. People of all income levels should be able to live here. Those were equally important, followed by housing affordability makes the community more inclusive and diverse. People should be able to choose the housing they want to live in, and keep living here as they age, as well as be able to live without fear of displacement. So, you know, the living and working here, that's certainly something that a lot of communities are concerned about. We aren't going to have no commuting if people could live and work in the same community, because some people will certainly live in Salem, in part because it's between Portland and Eugene, or for other sorts of reasons. So they will work in other places as well. Yeah. All right, choose the top 3 most important factors to you for choosing a place to live in Salem. And with this, I'll tell you what the answers were from the survey. Are people able to answer this question? I don't see anybody taking it quite yet. Okay, good. Okay, just give it another moment or 2 if anyone else wants to answer. So then affordability is our top answer, and 78% of people who responded to the survey, that was their answer also. So that was the top answer there. Type of housing, single family home, duplex, apartment, and location close to work or school. Those are coming in second place. And type of housing was identified by 66% of respondents of the survey as being an important factor. Physical condition of housing, what I see there, I don't have numbers here, but I'm going to guess that's somewhere around 20% to 25% of you said that it was an important factor. In the survey response, we had 72% say the condition of the building was an important factor, which says to me that we have some condition problems, especially for respondents of the survey. So that's something we should be paying attention to in the HPS that we wouldn't have necessarily known was an issue without this kind of outreach. Neighborhood diversity, location close to transit, number of bedrooms, and location close to things like shops and services. All came in with, I'm guessing, more than 10% of the vote here. Within the last 5 to 10 years, so thinking in a time-limited way, what challenges have you faced related to housing in Salem? And please select all that apply. Finding a home I can afford to rent, staying in my home when rents are increasing, finding a home I can afford to buy, finding a home that can accommodate my disability, finding a home that accommodates multiple generations, housing discrimination based on my race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, familial status, disability, and other things. Denial from housing based on lack of rental housing or past eviction, housing eviction. Denial of housing based on criminal history. Finding a home that accepts vouchers or other subsidies. Finding a home in good condition. Finding a home near shops and services. And finding a home near transit. So we'll just give it another few moments. Okay. And so let's see, finding a home I can afford to buy. That was the highest ranked one here. And on the survey, that's also the highest ranked one with 46% of respondents. Finding a home I can afford to rent, a little less than 30% of respondents here. On the survey, about 35% of respondents ranked that as one of their biggest challenge. Finding a home that can accommodate multiple generations, and finding a home that can accommodate my disability. Those also ranked very high here. Finding a home in good condition was identified as an issue on the survey, and I don't think we've got that one here. And staying in my home when rents are increasing was also identified. I see that we have some indication of denial of housing based on lack of rental history or past housing conviction, or based on criminal history. And those are certainly barriers to accessing housing. And I think that is, yes, that is all of our poll questions. And so, pardon me, let me just take that away. And so what you can see when we post the PowerPoint from the survey is you can see the results of these two questions that we included in here. The survey just closed yesterday, so there's still work to do on it. All right, so this implies, and I have implied, that we need to engage with the community on these topics. And Salem has been engaging with the community on housing over the last decade, especially around things like the comprehensive plan, along with other types of housing engagement. So this spring, as part of the Housing Production Strategy project, we completed the community survey, which I just mentioned. We've done some focus groups. So those are discussions with organizations that traditionally serve underserved communities so that we can hear more from people who are providing services to those communities. People in those communities are often hard to reach on their own. In-person events with traditionally underserved communities. I believe the city has done with an outreach with communities of color and youth, and then meetings with neighborhood land use chairs, community groups, and others. There'll be continued engagement as we can continue on in the housing production strategies. So what we've heard so far is that affordable housing options are really important at all income levels. Interestingly, bridging gaps between landlords and tenants is something we also heard. And what that means, I think, is that landlords may not know some of the challenges that tenants face. It may be that some, perhaps not all landlords, may be interested in engaging with tenants a little differently if they understood some of those barriers. So that speaks to something that the city might do about convening discussions between landlords and tenants. Ensuring quality and support maintenance of existing housing. And so how exactly Salem goes about doing that is something we'll need to discuss. And then a broader variety of housing types to meet diverse needs. We just heard about need for multi-generational housing. As you look at senior populations, especially, single level and ground floor housing is important, including for people with disabilities, and then more accessible units beyond ADA requirements. So these are some of the things that we're hearing that you don't necessarily see in the data. And that's exactly why we're trying to engage with communities. Salem's going to build on the existing policies, build new policies in the HPS on existing policies. I'm not going to read all of these policies aloud, but these are all things that the city has done and is doing to support development of affordable housing. So things like urban renewal funding. That's a way to fund housing programs, housing developments, really, I mean projects, as well as infrastructure in key areas. And it's often in key areas where you have things like access to services like medical services or access to transit. There's been a lot of regulatory improvements that have happened over the last few years with middle housing and multifamily housing code updates that the city has done. And then looking at things like ready build accessory dwelling unit plans. So those are architectural plans that if an accessory dwelling unit was built using those plans, then there are fewer things that they have to do with the city in order to build that housing. There's less approval that you need. So there's a lot of things that Salem is doing. You're not starting from scratch. Our next steps are about continuing the engagement with the stakeholders to understand barriers to addressing housing need. So essentially making sure that we're not missing anything. Continued analysis of potential development and redevelopment in mixed use areas. And that analysis can inform from a market perspective, what kind of supports are necessary to support development of housing that's affordable at different income levels. And then beginning to discuss the potential actions for inclusion in the housing production strategy. We'll be talking with the City Council and the Planning Commission next week about some of this, and I'm sure they'll be interested in talking about those potential actions, and that will continue on in discussion. And that is all we have. I'm going to unshare my screen here, and I believe that Lisa is going to facilitate a the question and answer piece part of this. So put your questions in the chat.
Great. And we already have some. First two are kind of process that I'll call on. The question is if the slides will be posted on the webpage, and then if people can access this webinar later.
Yes, I will put all of it online as soon as I can.
Perfect. So scrolling to the top. Let's see, someone has a question about United Way cottage development and about their shared common area. Can you speak to that, Eunice?
Sure. So the requirement in our code for cottage clusters is to have a certain area of a common courtyard, which can be landscaping or lawn area, doesn't necessarily need to be like an active recreational space. And so when those United Way cottage cluster proposals came through, they did meet those requirements.
There was a comment or question about if keeping property taxes low for new multifamily penalizes homeowners who don't get tax breaks.
And so what I will say is you don't, cities generally don't do this for all new multifamily development. Cities target the type of multifamily development they're looking at based on what is best meeting the community needs. So one property tax abatement is for income restricted affordable housing. So that's housing that's most affordable. That tax abatement can be a 20-year tax abatement or longer. And then another type of multifamily tax abatement is for you guys don't call it the multi-unit property tax.
UTIP.
MUTIP. Okay, that's what you call it there. And so that's a time-limited property tax abatement. And what the city usually gets out of that is housing that is affordable at below market rate for newly built housing. Usually, and Eunice, you or Lisa can tell us what the city does, but usually it's offered over 10 years and not beyond that, up to 10 years. And so to answer your question, it does impact the city's coffers and city funding. It doesn't increase property tax on existing homeowners, but it's not providing the city with that property tax during the period of exemption.
Great, thanks, Beth. There was a question about who will build small cottages for seniors and who would be setting maximum rent costs.
And so it really depends on how those cottages are built. So if it's market rate cottages, so it's a market rate developer, and there's no involvement from the city or the state, then the developer and then the owner eventually of the cottages would be setting the rent costs or the sales costs. You can also have cottage clusters and many other types of housing built that are built by things like community land trusts. And in that case, the community land trust is ensuring that housing remains comparatively affordable over a long period of time. The household who purchases the housing, because community land trusts are often purchasing, they will realize a certain amount of appreciation, so wealth generation through home ownership over time, but they won't have as much as if they just owned it on the market. And when it's sold next, it'll be continued to be at that, lower than market cost. So it's complicated. And oftentimes when you're looking at affordable rental housing or affordable homeownership housing, whether it's cottages or otherwise, it's a nonprofit organization who is setting the maximum rents or the maximum sales price according to agreements that they've come when they built it.
Great. There's a question about rent control, and is the city considering rent control to keep rents from going up really fast?
I have not heard that as being something that the city is considering. My understanding is the state passed statewide rent control, 2018, 19, 20, Beth, correct me if I'm wrong.
That is correct.
That caps it statewide, but I that, and I'm not sure that local conversation has occurred.
Okay, there was, I think, 1 or 2 questions about public schools, and if we increase our student population, how are the schools going to handle that?
Sure. So during the Our Salem project, when we were rezoning a lot of land to allow more multifamily development, whether in a multifamily zone or a mixed use zone that allows multifamily, we did meet with the school district because we knew there were kind of concerns, or we wanted to make sure we understood the concerns of the school district. So we were very thoughtful in terms of where we cited more multifamily land. Our understanding at the time was that the schools in Northeast had capacity issues already, were close to having capacity issues, but South and West had some space. That aligned with what we were hearing in the community anyway, in terms of trying to make sure that we had multifamily in West and South to create kind of the more opportunities for mixed income neighborhoods. And so during the Our Salem project, we did collaborate with the schools, and it aligned with the community's priorities as well.
Great, and there's a question about why was land rezoned to mixed use along the transit corridor if we don't know if it's actually feasible to provide housing? Was that a state mandate?
That was not a state mandate. It was a priority that came out of the 4-year community outreach project that was Our Salem. We heard that people wanted to have access to transit and frequent transit in terms of housing. We heard that from folks across, different housing needs. And in addition to that, one of the goals of the council at the time that was set through the council action in the climate action plan was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to site more housing with access to transit, so more people could live without having to drive to services, jobs, etc. So it was really coming out of community priorities as well as council direction.
And I will add on that even if it's not financially feasible right now, to develop that kind of housing, we are looking at long-range planning. And so the market certainly does change. And there may be changes that have nothing to do with housing directly that increase feasibility.
Great. There's a question inquiring if anyone on the panel today has ever personally managed a housing project from start to finish with the primary focus on profitability or self-sufficiency without government subsidy. So unless Beth has a hidden background that I don't know about, I would say we're not developers, but were you going to
That's part of the reason that we talk to developers very specifically, and we talk to developers quite a lot on a lot of projects across the state.
Great, thanks, Beth. Why does Oregon and Salem use 30% of disposable income as the level of affordable housing? Other countries use 30% of gross income or 40% of disposable income. In other words, they expect households to be able to pay up to 40% of disposable income without being burdened.
Oregon uses 30% of gross income, and it's a HUD standard specifically. So it's income before taxes. So 30% of income before taxes.
Great. Both Eugene and Portland have regulated legal tiny house on wheels for ADUs. Does Salem plan to include this in the future?
It could be under consideration as part of the housing production strategy. In the past, when this question has come up, it's generally the building code does not consider homes on wheels. They consider as to be homes as dwellings. And so that's been one of the reasons that we haven't moved forward with that, as opposed to considering them as like an RV park where they could be located. But we're open to all strategies at this point. That's kind of why we're doing this project.
So they're allowed today in RV parks already in Salem because they're considered RVs. Yeah, that's what you're saying. Yeah. Great. Does rent control cover park rent for manufactured home parks? Interesting question.
I do not know,
I don't
but
know.
I can find out.
Asking you, Eunice, to restate your response on the common area for United Way cottage development.
Around what the requirement was for cottage clusters.
I believe so, yes.
Cottage clusters are required to have a common courtyard. It has to be a certain size. It needs to be a single area. There are requirements around dimensions, but generally it has to be some sort of landscaping or lawn area. And again, my understanding, I didn't review the application, was that the United Way application for cottage clusters did meet the requirement.
Yep, that met the requirement. Let's see, and then there was, the first question, which I somehow missed, is what does it take to be a planner? Do you need a license with the city of Salem? I'll say you have to have the minimum of a bachelor's degree in urban planning or some related topic. Most planners here at the Salem actually have a master's degree in planning. And then many of the planners are certified planners, meaning you have to take a test by a national organization, and then you have to do continuing credits every year to keep your certification. Continuing education credits, I should say. I think that's all the questions I see in here. I don't think I skipped any. If somebody has something else, feel free to drop it in there.
I just wanted to add on to the question around if we're developers, which I am not a developer. But as Beth was saying, there's two portions of this project. One is a very specific market feasibility study where there'll be kind of deep dive conversations with developers and kind of understanding if there's gaps in the market and how the city could or couldn't help kind of achieve or to close that gap. That is not typically a requirement of housing production strategies, but it is something that we've heard through the years. That's been a kind of a comment or a question in the community. And so we have added that to this project. In addition, the next phase after we kind of confirm the housing needs in the community is going to focus on barriers. So there will be focus groups, again, with developers, both market rate developers and affordable housing developers. So if you're a developer or you're in the development world and you're interested in being part of one of those focus groups, please reach out to me and let me know. We're happy to add you to the list if you want to participate.
No more questions in the chat.
Great. Well, then I just wanted to thank everyone for coming today. I thank Beth as well and the team for putting this on and for your questions. We will be having a joint work session with the Planning Commission and the City Council on Monday, June 17th. And some of this will be repeat. We will go through the needs again, go through kind of the results of the engagement, and then we will move the discussion into potential strategies. So we're going to start talking with the council and the Planning Commission about what their ideas are, what they're open to, what maybe they aren't. So please participate if you want to join us and learn more. Thank you.